My name is Clara, and I'm 83 years old now. I sit here on my front porch in this quiet little town, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and I think about all the stories I've kept locked away. The rocking chair creaks beneath me, the same sound it's made for 20 years, and somehow that rhythm helps me find the courage to speak words I've swallowed for decades. There's one story I've never told anyone completely. Not my children, not my grandchildren, not even my late husband, God rest his soul. He knew pieces of it, of course. You can't share a bed with someone for 47 years without them sensing the shadows that follow you. But the whole truth? That's been mine alone to carry. When people hear I forgave my father, they call me a saint. They say I must have the biggest heart in the world. They pat my hand and tell me how wonderful it is that I could find such grace in my heart. But they don't know who told me to forgive him. They don't know what that forgiveness cost me. They don't know that sometimes forgiveness can be a cage that keeps you trapped longer than the hurt itself. I want to tell you this story now because I see too many young people carrying burdens that aren't theirs to carry. I see too many children being told to forgive when what they need is protection. I see too many families choosing silence over safety, and I can't watch it happen anymore without speaking up. At my age, what do I have to lose? My reputation? Let them talk. My family's perfect image? It was never real anyway. The truth is, I'm tired of pretending that everything worked out fine in the end. Yes, I survived. Yes, I built a good life. Yes, I raised 3 beautiful children who never knew a moment of fear in their own home. But survival isn't the same as justice, and healing doesn't erase what happened. It just teaches you how to carry the scars. So settle in, dear ones. This is a long story, and it's not always easy to hear, but it's true, every word of it. And maybe, just maybe, it will help someone else find their voice the way I eventually found mine. Maybe it will help some grandmother somewhere realize that protecting a child is more important than protecting a family's reputation. Maybe it will help some young girl understand that she doesn't owe forgiveness to anyone who hurt her, no matter what the adults in her life say. My earliest memory is of a sunny kitchen. I must have been 4 or 5 years old. My father was smiling at me, lifting me up to sit on the counter while he made breakfast. He had strong hands and a gentle laugh back then. Or maybe that's just how I choose to remember it, before everything changed. The mind has a way of polishing the good memories until they gleam, while the bad ones stay sharp as broken glass no matter how many years pass. In that kitchen, with yellow walls and white cabinets, I felt safe. My grandmother would come in, her gray hair pinned up tight, her dress always pressed perfect, even first thing in the morning. She'd kiss my forehead and call me her little blessing. She'd tell me stories about angels watching over good little girls, about how God had special plans for me. I believed her then. I believed everything she told me. Why wouldn't I? She was my grandmother, the woman who taught me to pray, who made sure I had clean clothes and hot meals, who tucked me in at night when my father worked late. She was my whole world, really, besides him. You see, memory is a funny thing when you're old. The good moments shine brighter, and the dark ones, well, they never quite fade the way you hope they will. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, when I still believed that family meant safety, and love meant never having to be afraid. Looking back now, I can see the signs that were always there. The way my father's jaw would tighten when I laughed too loud. The way my grandmother would quickly change the subject when neighbors asked about my mother. The way certain doors in our house were always kept locked, certain topics were never discussed, certain bruises were explained away before anyone could ask. But when you're a child, you don't see the cage being built around you. You just know that this is your normal, this is your family, this is love. And when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones defining what love looks like, how can you know that their definition is wrong? I need you to understand something before I continue. This isn't a story about hating my grandmother. Despite everything, I loved her until the day she died. This is a story about how good people can do terrible things when they're afraid. How faith can be twisted into a weapon. How the words, family first, can become a prison sentence for a child who has nowhere else to go. So here I sit, an old woman with arthritis in her fingers and silver in her hair, finally ready to tell the truth. Not for revenge, not for sympathy, but for all the little girls out there who are being told to forgive when what they really need is someone to fight for them. This is my story, but it's also theirs. And it's time it was told. I was raised by my widowed father and his mother, my grandmother, after my mother died giving birth to me. That's a heavy thing for a child to carry, knowing you came into the world as someone else left it. My father never said it was my fault, not with words anyway. But children are smart. We feel things in the silence, in the way someone looks at you when they think you're not watching. My father was what people called a pillar of the community. He owned the hardware store on Main Street, served on the church board, and always had a smile and a handshake for everyone in town. Women would stop my grandmother at the grocery store to tell her how lucky she was to have such a devoted son, how wonderful it was that he'd never remarried, dedicating himself to raising his daughter right. He was handsome too, my father. I can admit that now without feeling the complicated knot of emotions that used to come with the observation. Tall, with dark hair that he kept neat and parted to the side. Blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He dressed well, always in pressed shirts and polished shoes, even on Saturdays. People respected him. Men wanted to be his friend. Women brought us casseroles and pies, hoping to catch his attention. But he never seemed interested in any of them. He'd accept their offerings with polite thanks, compliment their cooking, and send them on their way. The town thought it was because he was still mourning my mother. The truth was more complicated, but I wouldn't understand that until much later. Our house was the biggest on the street, painted white with green shutters. 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch and a garden my grandmother tended with religious devotion. From the outside, it looked like something from a storybook. Inside, it was always clean, always quiet, always exactly the way my father wanted it. My grandmother ran that house like clockwork. Breakfast at 6:30 sharp, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, bedtime prayers at 8. Everything had its place, its time, its proper way of being done. She believed that order and routine were next to godliness, that a well-run home was a reflection of a well-ordered soul. She was strict, my grandmother, but in those early years, I thought it was just her way of loving me. She'd braid my hair every morning, her fingers gentle but firm, telling me that a lady should always look presentable. She taught me to read from the Bible before I started school, patient with my stumbling over the difficult words. She made sure I knew my prayers, my manners, my place. To her, blood was thicker than bruises, though I didn't know what that meant yet. The first signs of trouble were so small I barely noticed them. My father started coming home later from the store. His smiles became tighter, his patience thinner. He'd snap at me for small things like leaving a toy on the stairs or taking too long to finish my dinner. My grandmother would quickly intervene, sending me to my room while she soothed him, reminding him that I was just a child, that I didn't mean any harm. I remember being 6 years old, sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to them talk in the kitchen below. My father's voice was low and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. My grandmother's responses were soft, placating. Then I heard her say something that made my stomach feel funny, though I didn't know why. She said, "She looks just like her, James. You can't blame the child for that." After that night, things began to change in ways I couldn't quite name. My father would stare at me sometimes, his expression unreadable. He'd reach out like he wanted to touch my hair, then pull back as if I'd burned him. He started drinking after dinner, just a glass or 2 of whiskey, my grandmother said, to help him sleep. But his sleep was restless, and sometimes I'd hear him walking the halls at night, his footsteps heavy outside my door. My grandmother began watching me more carefully. She'd appear wherever I was, as if she had some 6th sense about where to find me. If I was playing in the garden, she'd come out with lemonade. If I was in my room with my dolls, she'd knock with cookies and milk. At the time, I thought she was just being a good grandmother. Now I wonder if she was standing guard. The church was our second home in those days. Wednesday night services, Sunday morning and evening. Vacation Bible school in the summer. Christmas pageants in the winter. My grandmother was proud of how well I knew my verses, how sweetly I sang in the children's choir. My father would sit in the front pew, his face serene, accepting compliments on what a good job he was doing raising me. But at home, the mask would slip. He'd criticize how I held my fork, how I walked, how I laughed. Too loud, too clumsy, too much like her. Always too much like her. I didn't understand who her was supposed to be. When I asked my grandmother about my mother, she'd get a distant look in her eyes and change the subject. All she'd say was that my mother had been beautiful but fragile, that God had called her home for reasons we couldn't understand, that we should be grateful for the time we had with her and focus on the present. But how could I be grateful for someone I'd never known? How could I miss someone who was just an empty space in every family photo? The summer I turned 7, my father hired a man named Mr. Thompson to help at the hardware store. He was younger than my father, with sandy hair and kind eyes. He'd joke with me when I came to the store after school, sneaking me candy when my father wasn't looking. He talked to me like I was a real person, not just a child to be seen and not heard. One day, Mr. Thompson asked if I'd like to go fishing with him and his own daughter, who was about my age. I was so excited, I could barely contain myself. But when I asked my father for permission, his face went dark. He said no without explanation, and when Mr. Thompson asked him directly, my father fired him on the spot. I never saw Mr. Thompson again. When I cried about it, my grandmother held me and said that my father knew best, that he was protecting me from things I couldn't understand. But protecting me from what? Mr. Thompson had been nice. His daughter could have been my friend. But questions weren't allowed in our house. Questions were disrespectful. Questions showed a lack of faith. Looking back, I think that was when my father realized he was losing control. I was getting older, meeting people, forming opinions. I was becoming my own person instead of just a reminder of my mother. And that scared him in ways I couldn't possibly understand. The hardware store became his fortress. He stopped letting me visit after school. He stopped attending church socials where I might talk to other families. Slowly, carefully, he began to isolate us. It was so gradual that it felt natural, like the changing of seasons. By the time I realized we were cut off from the world, the walls were already too high to climb. My grandmother must have seen what was happening. She was too smart not to notice the way our world was shrinking, the way my father's moods were darkening. But she'd lived through the depression, through the war, through the loss of her daughter-in-law. She believed in endurance, in keeping family business private, in trusting God to work things out in His own time. She'd tell me stories about the saints, about how they suffered for their faith and were rewarded in heaven. She'd read me the story of Job, who lost everything but never cursed God. She'd remind me that we were blessed to have a roof over our heads, food on our table, clothes on our backs. So many children had less. Who were we to complain? And she was right, in a way. We did have material comforts. I had toys and books and pretty dresses. I went to a good school and got good grades. From the outside, I had everything a little girl could want. Everything except the freedom to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to be a child, without carrying the weight of my father's grief and rage. The transformation was so slow that I adapted to it without realizing what was happening. The way you don't notice you're outgrowing your clothes until suddenly they don't fit anymore. The way you don't realize you're holding your breath until your lungs start to burn. By the time I understood that something was deeply wrong in our house, it was too late. The trap was already set, and I was already caught. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Before I can tell you about the darkness, I need you to understand the twilight. Those gray years when love and fear became so tangled that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When my grandmother's prayers became bars on my windows, and my father's protection became my prison. The first time my father hit me, I was 8 years old. I remember the date exactly because it was my birthday, October 12, 1949. My grandmother had made a chocolate cake with pink frosting, and I'd been allowed to invite 3 girls from school for a small party. It was the first time in months that other children had been in our house, and I was so happy I could barely sit still. The party went well at first. We played games in the parlor, had cake and ice cream in the dining room. My grandmother had even decorated with streamers and balloons, something she usually considered frivolous. The other girls admired our big house, my many toys, the pretty dress my grandmother had sewn for the occasion. For a few hours, I felt like a normal little girl with a normal family. But then Mary Beth, one of my classmates, asked to see a picture of my mother. Such an innocent question. She didn't know it was forbidden territory. I didn't even think before I answered, telling her I didn't have any pictures, that my father kept them locked away. The room went quiet. My grandmother's face went pale. And my father, who had been standing in the doorway, went very, very still. He smiled at the other girls, that charming smile everyone in town knew. He said something about how painful it was to lose someone you loved, how the pictures were too hard to look at. The mothers came to collect their daughters soon after, and everyone said what a lovely party it had been. But after they left, after the door closed behind the last guest, the house felt like it was holding its breath. My grandmother started cleaning up, her movements quick and nervous. She told me to go change out of my party dress, but my father said no, I should stay right where I was. He wanted to talk to me about what I'd said, about privacy, about family business, about respect. His voice was calm at first. Disappointed, he said. He was so disappointed that I would embarrass him like that, telling people our private business. Didn't I know better? Hadn't my grandmother taught me better? I tried to apologize, but he wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted me to understand. He wanted me to learn. The slap came without warning. Not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough to make my ears ring. Hard enough to make my grandmother gasp. I stood there, my hand on my cheek, too shocked to cry. In all my 8 years, no one had ever hit me. Not even a spanking. And now my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, had marked my birthday with violence. My grandmother stepped forward, started to say something, but my father turned on her with such fury that she stepped back again. He asked if she had something to say, if she wanted to question his authority in his own house, if she thought she knew better how to raise his daughter. She shook her head, her hands clasped so tight, her knuckles were white. Then he turned back to me. He said this was for my own good, that I needed to learn discretion, that loose lips sink ships, and our family ship needed to stay afloat. He sent me to bed without supper, and I climbed the stairs on shaky legs, my cheeks still burning, my heart racing like a trapped bird. My grandmother came to my room later with a cold cloth for my face and a piece of cake she'd saved. She sat on my bed and held me while I cried. She told me my father was under a lot of stress. That running a business was hard, that being a single parent was hard, that sometimes adults did things they didn't mean when they were overwhelmed. She said he loved me. She said God would forgive him, and so should I. She said we needed to pray for him, to help him find peace. And then she said something that would echo in my mind for years to come. She said, "He's your father, Clara, the only one you'll ever have. We must be patient with him." That became the pattern. My father would lose his temper over something small, a glass of spilled milk, a toy left on the stairs, a laugh that was too loud, or a question that was too bold. The punishment would be swift and sharp, a slap, a grip on my arm tight enough to leave bruises, being locked in my room for hours or sometimes an entire day. And always, always, my grandmother would come after with her cold cloths and her explanations. Stress, grief, the burden of raising a child alone. Never his fault, not really. Always something I could have done differently, something I should have known better about, some way I could have avoided triggering his anger. She taught me to move quietly through the house, to speak only when spoken to keep my expressions neutral, my opinions to myself. She taught me to read his moods like weather patterns, to sense the storms before they broke. She taught me to be small, to be invisible, to be perfect. And when perfection wasn't enough, she taught me to forgive. The bruises were always in places that wouldn't show. My upper arms, my back, my legs above the knee. My grandmother would treat them with arnica and prayer, making me promise not to complain. We couldn't have people talking. We couldn't have people questioning. What would the town think? What would the church think? Didn't I understand how much worse things could be? She'd tell me stories about orphanages, about children with no families at all, about foster homes where strangers raised you without love, about the great blessing it was to have a father who kept a roof over my head and food on the table. So what if he was strict? So what if his hands were heavy? Spare the rod and spoil the child, the Bible said. School became my refuge, the only place where I could forget for a few hours. I threw myself into my studies, earning perfect grades, hoping that achievement might earn approval. But nothing was ever good enough. A 98 on a test meant I'd been careless with 2 points. Being chosen for the school play meant I was seeking attention. Making a friend meant I was getting distracted from my duties at home. The isolation tightened like a noose. Birthday parties were out of the question after that first disaster. Sleepovers were for girls with loose morals. After-school activities would interfere with my chores. One by one, my connections to the outside world were severed, until the only people in my life were my father, my grandmother, and the carefully controlled interactions at church. But even church became a minefield. I had to be careful not to be too friendly with other families, not to accept invitations, not to let anyone get too close. My grandmother would sit beside me, her hand on my arm, a gentle pressure that reminded me to smile but not too much, to sing but not too loud, to be present but not memorable. The worst part was how normal it all seemed from the outside. My father's reputation remained spotless. He was still the successful businessman, the devoted single father, the pillar of the community. When people commented on how well-behaved I was, how quiet and obedient, he'd smile that public smile and talk about the importance of discipline and structure for children. And my grandmother, oh, she was masterful at keeping up appearances. My clothes were always clean and pressed, my hair always neatly braided. I never went to school with visible bruises, never appeared underfed or neglected. If anything, I looked like a child who was perhaps too well cared for, too closely watched, too perfectly controlled. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, listening to my father's footsteps on the stairs, wondering if he'd had a bad day at the store, wondering if I'd done something wrong without realizing it, wondering if tonight would be one of the nights when his anger couldn't wait until morning. My grandmother had a room on the 3rd floor, far from mine, far enough that she could claim not to hear things, far enough to maintain her plausible deniability. But she knew. Of course she knew. She was the one who washed the blood from my pillowcases when his ring caught my lip. She was the one who kept me home from school when the bruises were too dark to hide. She was the one who taught me to lie to the doctor about how I'd gotten hurt, who stood behind me with her hand on my shoulder while I recited the story about falling down the stairs or running into a door. To her, these were necessary sacrifices, small prices to pay for keeping our family together. She'd tell me about the shame of broken homes, about children who grew up wild without proper guidance. She'd remind me that my father had never abandoned us, never brought another woman into our home, never spent his paycheck on drink or gambling like some men did. We should be grateful. We should be forgiving. We should be faithful that God would soften his heart in time. Time. That's what she always promised. That things would get better with time. That his grief would fade with time. That his anger would cool with time. But time was passing, and instead of getting better, things were getting worse. The slaps became punches, the bruises became welts. And the little girl who had once laughed too loud was learning not to make any sound at all. By the time I turned 10, I had learned to navigate my father's moods like a sailor reads the wind. There were signs I could watch for. The way he'd drum his fingers on the dinner table meant I should eat quickly and disappear. The particular angle of his jaw when he read the evening paper meant I shouldn't ask for help with homework. The sound of his car door slamming just a bit too hard meant I should already be in my room when he came inside. But sometimes there were no warnings. Sometimes the storm came from clear skies, and those were the times that scared me most. Because if I couldn't predict it, I couldn't prevent it. And if I couldn't prevent it, then maybe my grandmother was wrong. Maybe it wasn't about my behavior at all. Maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made my father hate me. The abuse took many forms by then. Physical violence was just one tool in his arsenal. There were the punishments that looked reasonable from the outside but were torture for a child. Kneeling on rice for hours, holding heavy books with outstretched arms until my muscles screamed, standing in the corner from the moment I got home from school until bedtime. If I moved, if I dropped the books, if I shifted my weight while kneeling, the punishment would double. Then there was the isolation. By 5th grade, I had no friends. How could I? I wasn't allowed to invite anyone over or accept invitations. I couldn't join clubs or sports teams. I went to school, came straight home, did my chores, did my homework, and went to bed. Weekends were for cleaning and church. Summers were long stretches of emptiness, watching other children play from my bedroom window. The silent treatment might last for days or even weeks. My father would look through me like I was a ghost, refusing to acknowledge my existence. I'd set his place at the table, serve his meals, clean his dishes, all while being treated as invisible. My grandmother would speak for me during these times, referring to me in the third person. Clara has finished her chores. Clara is ready for church. As if I wasn't standing right there, desperate for someone to see me. But the cruelest punishment was when he'd be kind. After a particularly bad episode, he'd sometimes show up with a gift. A new dress. A book. Once, a beautiful porcelain doll with real hair and eyes that closed. He'd be gentle then, almost tender. He'd tell me he was sorry things had gotten out of hand. That he only wanted what was best for me. That if I could just be good, if I could just be better, we could be a happy family. Those moments of kindness hurt worse than the violence. Because for a few hours or days I'd have hope. I'd think maybe this time things would change. Maybe I'd figured out the secret to keeping him happy. Maybe my grandmother was right, and his heart was finally softening. But then I'd breathe wrong or look too much like my mother, and the cycle would begin again. My grandmother became an expert at damage control. She had remedies for everything. Arnica for bruises, ice for swelling, makeup techniques for when I got older and the marks were harder to hide. She taught me to style my hair to cover finger marks on my neck, to wear long sleeves in summer, to sit in ways that didn't aggravate injured ribs. She also taught me the art of explanation. Every injury had a story. I was clumsy. I was careless. I played too rough at recess. I fell off my bike, down the stairs, into furniture. We rehearsed these stories until I could tell them without flinching, until they sounded more real than the truth. She'd quiz me before doctor visits, making sure I knew my lines. The psychological games were constant. My father would tell me I was stupid, then rage when I didn't get perfect grades. He'd call me ugly, then explode if he caught me looking in a mirror. He'd say I was worthless, then demand to know why I wasn't more confident. It was like living in a maze where the walls kept shifting, where every path led to another trap. Food became a battleground. If I ate too much, I was a glutton. If I ate too little, I was ungrateful. If I asked for seconds, I was greedy. If I didn't finish my plate, I was wasteful. My grandmother would sneak me food sometimes, crackers and cheese hidden in my room. But if my father found out, we'd both pay for it. So I learned to be hungry, to make it through the day, on whatever portion he deemed appropriate. Sleep was another weapon. He'd wake me in the middle of the night to do chores, claiming I hadn't done them properly earlier. He'd stand in my doorway for hours, just watching, making sure I wasn't reading with a flashlight or doing anything other than lying perfectly still. Sometimes he'd decide my room was too comfortable and make me sleep on the floor as punishment for some real or imagined offense. The church, which should have been a refuge, became another stage for performance. I'd sit between my father and grandmother, the perfect family unit, while inside I was screaming. The sermons about honoring thy father felt like salt in my wounds. The lessons about forgiveness felt like chains around my ankles. And always, always, there was my grandmother whispering that God was testing us, that suffering built character, that we'd be rewarded in heaven for our trials on earth. I started having nightmares, terrible dreams where I was drowning and no one would throw me a rope, where I was screaming and no one could hear me, where I was running but my legs wouldn't move. I'd wake up gasping, soaked in sweat, and lie there listening for footsteps, wondering if I'd cried out in my sleep, wondering if I'd brought fresh anger down on myself. School remained my only escape, but even that was tainted. Teachers would comment on how tired I looked, and I'd recite my grandmother's explanations about growth spurts and the demands of helping at home. They'd praise my perfect homework, not knowing I'd redone it 3 times to avoid any possibility of criticism. They'd worry about my lack of friends, and I'd smile and say I was just shy, that I preferred books to people. One teacher, Miss Peterson, seemed to see through the facade. She kept me after class one day in 6th grade, sat me down, and asked if everything was all right at home. For a moment, just a moment, I thought about telling her everything. But then I remembered my grandmother's warnings about foster care, about being taken away, about bringing shame on our family. So I smiled and lied, and eventually she had to let me go. That night, my father was waiting. Someone had seen Miss Peterson talking to me, had reported back that I'd been kept after school. What had I told her? What lies had I spread? What family secrets had I revealed? No amount of truth could convince him that I'd said nothing. The punishment lasted for hours, and the next day my grandmother kept me home, claiming I had the flu. When I finally returned to school, Miss Peterson looked at me with such concern that I couldn't meet her eyes. She tried a few more times to reach out, but I'd learned my lesson. Help was dangerous. Concern was a trap. The only safety was in being invisible, in being perfect, in being nothing at all. My 12th birthday came and went without acknowledgement. My father had decided that birthdays were celebrations of vanity, that they encouraged selfishness and pride. My grandmother made my favorite dinner, but we ate it in silence like any other meal. That night, I lay in bed and tried to remember the last time I'd laughed. Really laughed, not the polite sound I made at church when someone told a joke. I couldn't remember. The doll he'd given me sat on my dresser, her glass eyes reflecting the moonlight. Sometimes I thought she looked sad. Sometimes I thought she looked afraid. Sometimes I envied her, because at least she couldn't feel pain. At least she couldn't disappoint anyone. At least she was exactly what she was supposed to be, forever and always. But I was changing. Puberty was approaching, and with it came new dangers. My body was betraying me, developing curves that made my father's anger sharper, more focused. I looked more like my mother every day, he said, and that resemblance was becoming unbearable for him. My grandmother started making my dresses looser, my hairstyles more severe, as if she could hide my growing womanhood under fabric and bobby pins. The worst part was that I still loved him. Despite everything, he was my father, the only parent I had. When he was calm, when he was distant but not cruel, I could almost pretend we were a normal family. I could almost believe that if I just tried harder, if I just figured out the secret, I could make him love me back. My grandmother encouraged this hope, telling me that love was patient, love was kind, love endured all things. But I was starting to wonder if what we had in our house was love at all, or if it was something else entirely, something dark and twisted that just wore love's mask when the world was watching. The summer I turned 13, everything changed. It started with a church picnic, one of those community events my father couldn't avoid without raising questions. The whole town gathered at Riverside Park, families spreading blankets under the oak trees, children running free, the smell of barbecue mixing with the sound of laughter. For most people, it was a perfect Saturday. For me, it was a minefield. My grandmother had dressed me carefully that morning, a modest dress that hung loose on my changing body, my hair braided so tight it made my head ache. She'd given me the usual warnings about staying close, speaking only when spoken to, not drawing attention. My father had added his own threat, quiet and specific, about what would happen if I embarrassed him. But something about that day, maybe the sunshine or the sound of other teenagers laughing by the river, made me reckless. When Sarah Martinez asked if I wanted to join their group for volleyball, I said yes without thinking. For 1 hour, one precious hour, I was just a normal girl playing a game. I laughed when I missed the ball. I cheered when we scored. I forgot to be invisible. I didn't see my father watching from the pavilion. I didn't notice how his hands clenched around his lemonade glass. I didn't realize my grandmother was frantically trying to catch my eye. I was just playing, just being 13, just existing without fear for the first time in so long. The ride home was silent. My grandmother sat in the back seat with me, her hand over mine, her thumb rubbing circles that were meant to be comforting but felt like a warning. My father drove with both hands gripping the wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw set in that particular angle I knew so well. At home, he sent my grandmother to her room. She went without protest, though I saw her lips moving in what might have been prayer. Then it was just him and me in the living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the windows, the sounds of normal life drifting in from the street outside. He didn't yell, that would have been easier. Instead, he spoke in this calm, measured voice about how I'd humiliated him. How everyone had seen me acting like a common girl, throwing myself around, seeking attention from boys. How Mrs. Henderson had asked if I was feeling all right, acting so unlike myself. How Pastor Williams had joked about teenagers and their moods. Then he hit me. Not a slap this time, but a closed fist to my stomach that drove all the air from my lungs. I doubled over, gasping, and he grabbed my braid, using it to pull me upright. The beating that followed was methodical, careful, designed to cause maximum pain without leaving marks that would show. He knew exactly where to strike, exactly how much force to use, exactly when to stop before serious damage. When it was over, I lay on the living room floor, every breath sending fire through my ribs. He stood over me, straightening his shirt, smoothing his hair. He told me this was my fault, that I'd forced his hand, that if I acted like a decent daughter, he could treat me like one. Then he stepped over me and went upstairs, leaving me there like a broken doll. My grandmother found me an hour later. She helped me to my room, undressed me with shaking hands, surveyed the damage with wet eyes. The bruises were already blooming across my torso, purple and black like storm clouds. She ran a bath with Epsom salts, helped me into the water, held my hand while I bit my lip to keep from screaming. That night, she sat on my bed longer than usual. She told me about her own childhood, about her father who'd been strict but fair, about how different things were now, how soft children had become, how the world was changing in dangerous ways. She said my father was trying to protect me from all that his methods might be harsh, but his intentions were pure. Then she said something that broke whatever trust remained between us. She said that if I could just stop provoking him, if I could just be more careful, more obedient, more like a proper young lady, then the punishments would stop. She made it sound so simple, like I was choosing this, like I wanted to be hurt. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth. She was afraid too, not of being hurt, but of the family falling apart, of scandal, of having to face what our life really was. She needed to believe it was my fault because the alternative, that she was letting her son destroy his daughter, was unbearable. That was my breaking point, not the beating, though it was the worst yet, not the pain, though it lasted for weeks. But that moment of understanding that my grandmother, the woman who claimed to love me, would always choose him, would always find a way to make it my fault, would always prioritize the family's reputation over my safety. I started planning that night. Not consciously at first, but somewhere deep inside, a seed of rebellion took root. I began to pay attention to different things. Bus schedules, train routes, how much money my father kept in the cash box at the store, where my grandmother hid the emergency funds, what I could carry in a small bag, where a 13-year-old girl might go to disappear. School started again in September, and I threw myself into my studies with new purpose. Not to please my father, but to prepare for a future without him. I read everything I could find about other places, other lives, other ways of being. I volunteered to help in the library, telling my grandmother it would look good on college applications. Really, I was researching, planning, dreaming of escape. But my father sensed the change in me. Where before I'd been trying to earn his love, now I was just trying to survive. He noticed my newfound indifference to his moods, my mechanical compliance with his rules. It made him angry in new ways. The punishments became more creative, more psychological. He'd destroy things I cared about, rip up books I was reading, break small treasures I'd managed to collect. Once, he made me watch while he burned a letter my teacher had written praising my essay. My grandmother tried to restore the balance. She'd leave little treats in my room, attempt conversations about forgiveness and family loyalty. She'd tell me stories about girls who ran away and came to bad ends, about the dangers waiting for young women in the world, about how lucky I was to have a father who cared enough to discipline me, even if his methods were harsh. But I was done listening. I smiled and nodded, played the part of the repentant daughter, but inside I was stone. Every beating made me stronger. Every cruel word built my resolve. Every day I survived was a day closer to freedom. I just had to be patient. I just had to be smart. I just had to stay alive. The thing about abuse is that it becomes normal. You adapt. You learn to function with fear as your constant companion. You discover reserves of strength you didn't know existed, but you also lose things. Trust, joy, the ability to relax, the belief that you deserve kindness. These things don't come back easily, even after the danger passes. Winter came early that year, and with it a new kind of isolation. The weather gave my father more excuses to keep me home. Too cold for church socials, too icy for school some days, too dangerous for a young girl to be out. My world shrank even further, until it was just the house, school when permitted, and the suffocating presence of my father's rage. But I had my secret now, my plan, my hope. Every night before sleep, I'd imagine myself on a bus heading anywhere else. I'd picture cities I'd only read about, lives I could only dream of. Sometimes the fantasy was elaborate, sometimes it was simple, but always, I was free. One night in February, my father came to my room late. Not to hurt me, but to talk. He sat on the edge of my bed and told me I reminded him so much of my mother, how she'd been beautiful but weak. How she'd made him promises she couldn't keep. How she'd left him with a child who carried her face like an accusation. For the first time, I heard grief mixed with his anger. But it didn't make me pity him. It made me understand that I was paying for someone else's sins, bearing the weight of his loss in my bones. I was a ghost he couldn't exorcise, a reminder he couldn't escape. And as long as I stayed, we'd be locked in this terrible dance forever. That's when I knew I didn't have time to wait until I was 18. I didn't have time for careful planning and perfect preparation, because something in his eyes that night told me his restraint was failing. The careful boundaries he'd maintained, the rules he'd followed to keep the abuse hidden, were starting to crumble. My grandmother saw it too. She started sleeping with her door locked. She jumped at shadows. She prayed louder and longer, as if volume could reach heaven faster. But she never spoke of leaving. Never suggested we needed help. Just more prayer, more forgiveness, more patience with a man who was coming apart at the seams. The breaking point was approaching for all of us. The only question was who would shatter first. The night I ran away was a Tuesday in March, 1955. I was 17 years old, and I'd been planning for months. Not the 4 years I'd originally intended, but my father's deterioration had accelerated my timeline. The previous week, he'd started locking me in my room at night. Not just closing the door, but installing a deadbolt on the outside. My grandmother had watched him do it, wringing her hands but saying nothing. I'd prepared carefully. Small amounts of money taken over time from the grocery budget, hidden in a tampon box I knew my father would never touch. A change of clothes rolled tight and hidden behind books on my shelf. A bus ticket purchased 3 towns over during a supposed school field trip. Everything had to be perfect. I'd only get one chance. That night, my father had been drinking more than usual. The anniversary of my mother's death was approaching, and it always made him worse. He'd raged at dinner about my posture, my expression, the way I held my fork. My grandmother had tried to deflect his attention, but he'd turned on her too, asking if she thought she knew better how to raise his daughter. After dinner, he'd locked me in as usual. I heard his footsteps fade down the hall, heard his bedroom door close. My grandmother's steps on the stairs to the 3rd floor were slower, heavier. I waited 2 hours, until the house was silent except for my father's snoring. Then I went to work. The window was my only option. I'd been loosening the painted seal for weeks, working at it with a butter knife I'd stolen from the kitchen. It finally gave way with a crack that sounded like thunder to my terrified ears. I froze, listening, but no footsteps came. Slowly, carefully, I pushed it open and looked down at the kitchen roof below. I'd practice this in my mind 1,000 times. Lower myself from the sill, drop to the kitchen roof, slide down to the gutter, drop to the ground. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. But staying was no longer an option. That morning, my father had mentioned a doctor who specialized in nervous conditions, a place upstate where troubled young women could get help. I knew what that meant. I'd heard whispers about those places at church, girls who went in and came out different, if they came out at all. The drop to the kitchen roof knocked the wind out of me, but I couldn't stop. I slid down the shingles, scraping my palms raw on the rough surface. The gutter creaked under my weight but held. Then I was on the ground, in the backyard where I'd played as a little girl, where my grandmother grew her tomatoes and roses. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to walk. Running would draw attention. A girl walking purposefully might just be heading to an early job. I had 2 miles to cover to reach the bus station in the next town. 2 miles of jumping at every shadow, every car that passed, every dog that barked. The bus station was nearly empty at 4 a.m. Just me and an old man sleeping on a bench. I bought my ticket with shaking hands, half expecting to be questioned, but the clerk barely looked at me. The bus to Chicago would leave in 30 minutes. 30 minutes to disappear forever. I sat in the back corner of the waiting room, making myself small. Every sound made my heart race. Every person who entered made me shrink further into my coat. When a police car drove past, I nearly fainted. But it kept going, and slowly I began to believe I might actually make it. The bus arrived late, belching diesel fumes and promise. I climbed aboard, found a seat near the back, and watched my hometown disappear in the gray dawn light. With every mile, I felt something loosening in my chest, fear giving way to something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten its name: hope. Chicago was overwhelming, bigger and louder than anything I'd ever experienced. But in that chaos, I could disappear. I found a YWCA that offered cheap rooms and didn't ask too many questions. I gave them a fake name, paid a week in advance, and collapsed on the narrow bed in my tiny room. For the first time in years, I slept without fear. Finding work was harder than I'd imagined. I had no references, no experience, no real identity I could use. But I was smart and desperate, and eventually I found a diner that needed a waitress who could work nights. The owner, a Greek woman named Stella, took one look at me and seemed to understand. She didn't ask questions about my past. She just showed me how to balance plates and pour coffee without spilling. Those first months were the hardest and the best of my life. Hard because I was alone, scared, constantly looking over my shoulder. Best because every choice was mine. What to eat, what to wear, when to sleep, when to speak. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I waited tables at night and spent my days at the public library, reading everything I could get my hands on. Books about psychology, trying to understand what had happened to me. Books about law, wondering if what my father had done was criminal. Books about other places, other lives, other ways of being. I was 17 years old and teaching myself how to be human. 6 months after I ran, I saw a newspaper article about a missing girl from my hometown. My school photo stared back at me, younger and sadder than I remembered. The article quoted my father, distraught about his troubled daughter who'd run away despite his best efforts to provide a good home. My grandmother was mentioned too, described as heartbroken over her granddaughter's disappearance. They sounded like the perfect family, destroyed by an ungrateful child. I burned the newspaper and never looked back. Slowly, I built a life. I got my GED, then took night classes at the community college. I moved from the diner to an office job, then to better positions as I gained skills and confidence. I made friends carefully, always keeping parts of myself hidden, but learning to trust in small ways. I even dated, though it took years before I could let anyone touch me without flinching. Therapy helped when I could finally afford it. My first therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Chen, helped me understand that what had happened wasn't my fault, that my father was sick, that my grandmother was complicit, that forgiveness wasn't required for healing. She helped me see that survival was its own form of courage. I built walls around my past, created a new identity, complete with a believable backstory. To everyone who knew me, I was an orphan who'd aged out of the foster system. It was easier than the truth and invited fewer questions. I learned to navigate the world as this new person, someone who'd had a difficult childhood but nothing specific, nothing that required explanation. Years passed. I moved from Chicago to Milwaukee, then Minneapolis, always staying in the Midwest but never getting too close to home. I finished college, started a career in social work, driven by a need to help children who couldn't help themselves. I learned to recognize the signs I wished someone had seen in me. The perfect child who never caused trouble. The grandmother who explained too much. The father whose reputation mattered more than anything. I saved 13 children over my career. 13 kids who might have ended up like me or worse. That's not pride talking, just fact. 13 times I saw what others missed, asked the questions others were afraid to ask, pushed when others wanted to look away. 13 children who got the intervention I never did. But healing isn't linear. There were nightmares that lasted decades. Relationships that failed because I couldn't explain why certain things triggered panic. Days when a stranger's raised voice would send me hiding in bathroom stalls, trying to remember how to breathe. The body keeps score, even when the mind tries to forget. I was 35 when I met Robert, the man who would become my husband. He was patient in ways I didn't know people could be. He never pushed for details about my past, never questioned my need for space, never raised his voice even when we argued. He loved me despite the walls I'd built, or maybe because he understood why I'd built them. We had 3 children together, and I promised myself they would never know fear in their own home. I might have overcorrected sometimes, been too permissive where my father had been too strict. But they grew up knowing they were loved, that mistakes were allowed, that home was safe. That's all I'd wanted for myself. To give them that felt like breaking a curse. Still, the past haunted me. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw my mother's face, the one that had triggered such rage in my father. Every time I braided my daughter's hair, I remembered my grandmother's tight plaits. Every time I drove past a hardware store, I wondered if he was still alive, still charming the town, still fooling everyone. But mostly, I lived. I chose joy wherever I could find it. I built a family based on love instead of fear. I helped other survivors find their own paths to freedom. I refused to let what happened to me define my entire life, even though it had shaped me in ways I'm still discovering. The escape was just the beginning. Healing took decades. Building a life worth living took even longer. But I did it. That scared 17-year-old girl who dropped from a window into the night became a woman who refused to be broken. And that, I think, is its own kind of victory. 20 years after I escaped, I received a letter forwarded through several old addresses. My hands shook when I recognized the careful script. My grandmother had found me, or at least found a trail that led close enough. The letter was brief, just a few lines on church stationery. My father was dying. He wanted to see me. She begged me to come home, to grant a dying man forgiveness, to let old wounds heal. I sat with that letter for 3 days, read it over and over, looking for hidden meanings, secret threats, any sign that it was a trap. My husband found me crying over it one night and held me while I told him more than I'd ever shared before. He said the choice was mine, that he'd support whatever I decided, but that I owed them nothing. Not forgiveness, not closure, not one more minute of my life. But I went. Not for them, but for me. To see if the monsters from my nightmares were really just broken people, to face the past I'd run from. To prove to myself that I was no longer that terrified girl who jumped from a window into the darkness. The town looked smaller than I remembered, shabby even. The mighty hardware store was closed, windows boarded up. The house that had loomed so large in my memory was just a house, paint peeling, garden overgrown. Time had done what I couldn't. It had diminished them. My grandmother answered the door, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She was tiny, bent with age, her once stern face collapsed into wrinkles. She reached for me, then stopped, her hand hanging in the air between us. I didn't bridge the gap. She led me to his room in silence. The smell hit me first. Illness and decay, and something else. Something that made my child self want to run. But I was no longer a child. I was a 40-year-old woman with my own children, my own life, my own power. I could leave whenever I wanted. He was skeleton thin, propped up in bed, oxygen tube in his nose. The strong hands that had hurt me were spotted and weak. The voice that had terrorized me was a whisper, but the eyes were the same. Blue and cold and full of something that might have been rage or might have been fear. He didn't apologize. I hadn't expected him to. Instead, he talked about my mother, about how much I looked like her, about how unfair it was that she'd left him. Even dying, he was still the victim in his own story, still unable to see what he'd done, still convinced that his pain justified everything. I let him talk. When he finished, when he asked if I forgave him, I told him the truth. No, I didn't forgive him. I'd survived him, I'd escaped him, I'd built a life despite him, but forgiveness? That wasn't mine to give. He'd have to find that elsewhere, if such a thing existed for men who beat their daughters. His face went red, then purple. My grandmother stepped forward, started to speak, but I held up my hand. I wasn't done. I told him about my children, about how they'd never been hit, never been afraid, never wondered if they were loved. I told him about the children I'd saved, the ones who'd gotten the help I'd never received. I told him that every good thing in my life had grown from the soil of his cruelty, not because of it but in spite of it. Then I turned to my grandmother. Sweet, religious, complicit grandmother. I asked her why she'd chosen him over me, why she'd made excuses, why she'd taught me that suffering was holy when what I'd needed was protection. She cried then, ugly tears that made her face crumble. She said she'd been afraid, that she'd been raised to believe men knew best, that families stayed together, that God would fix things if they just had faith. She said she'd prayed every night for the strength to do something, but the prayers had never been answered. I could have been cruel, could have listed every opportunity she'd had to save me, could have thrown her own Bible verses back at her about protecting the innocent. But looking at her, this small, frightened woman who'd spent her whole life submitting to angry men, I found something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. She'd been trapped, too, in her own way. Trapped by faith, twisted into chains, by a generation that taught women to endure rather than escape. I stayed for an hour. No reconciliation, no tearful reunions, no deathbed redemption. Just truth, spoken aloud in the room where so many lies had lived. When I left, my grandmother walked me to the door. She pressed something into my hand. A photograph, creased and yellowed. My mother, young and smiling, holding a baby. Holding me. She said my mother had been planning to leave, had been saving money, making arrangements. The death in childbirth had been unexpected, a tragedy that no one could have prevented. But she'd wanted me to know that my mother had loved me, had wanted better for me. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small truth after so many lies. My father died 3 days later. I didn't go to the funeral. My grandmother sent me a letter afterward, telling me he'd raged until the end, cursing my name, my mother's name, God's name. She said she was selling the house, moving to a retirement home. She said she was sorry. Such a small word for such a big betrayal, but I supposed it was all she had. I never saw her again. She died 5 years later, and I felt nothing but a strange emptiness. Not grief, not relief, just the echo of what might have been if she'd been braver, if she'd chosen differently, if she'd remembered that protecting children was more important than protecting reputation. That visit home changed something in me. Seeing them diminished, human, mortal, took away their power to haunt my dreams. The nightmares that had plagued me for decades faded. Not completely, never completely, but enough that I could sleep through the night more often than not. I told my children the truth when they were old enough to understand. Not all the details, but enough. I wanted them to know why I sometimes flinched at sudden movements, why I never yelled even when I was angry, why I hugged them so fiercely and so often. They needed to understand that family wasn't always safe, that love shouldn't hurt, that they should never stay in a situation that damaged them. My daughter asked me once if I ever regretted running away, if I ever wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd kept trying to fix things. I told her that running away had saved my life, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave, that forgiveness is not required for healing, and that staying in an abusive situation, hoping it will get better, is like standing in fire, hoping it will stop burning. Now here I am, 83 years old, sitting on a different porch in a different town, watching a different sunset. My husband is gone, but my children visit often. My grandchildren laugh freely in my home, never wondering if they're safe, never walking on eggshells, never making themselves small. The cycle broke with me. The chain of pain ended when I jumped from that window. I think about the girl I was, so desperate for love that I accepted cruelty. I think about the young woman I became, building a life from scratch with nothing but determination. I think about all the years between then and now, all the therapy and tears and small triumphs that led to this moment, this peace. To anyone listening who recognizes themselves in my story, I want you to know something. You are not required to forgive. You are not required to stay. You are not required to keep family secrets that are killing you. You are allowed to save yourself, even if no one else will. You are allowed to build a new life, far from the people who hurt you. You are allowed to define family as the people who actually love you, not just the ones who share your blood. And to the grandmothers, the mothers, the aunts, the family members who see abuse and choose silence, I have this to say. Your fear is understandable, but it is not excusable. Every time you make excuses for an abuser, you become one yourself. Every time you tell a child to forgive instead of getting them help, you fail in your most basic duty. Every time you choose family reputation over a child's safety, you perpetuate the cycle. My grandmother died, believing she'd done her best in a difficult situation. But her best included watching her son beat me for years and telling me to pray harder. Her best included lying to doctors and teachers and anyone who might have helped. Her best included choosing a grown man's anger over a child's safety, again and again and again. That's not love. That's not faith. That's complicity, dressed up in Bible verses and family loyalty. And it's not acceptable. Not then, not now, not ever. I survived, but not everyone does. Some children don't make it to 17. Some don't find the strength to jump from windows into uncertain futures. Some believe the lies they're told about forgiveness and family and stay until it destroys them. For them, I tell this story. For them, I refuse to soften the edges or pretend it all worked out in the end. Yes, I built a good life. Yes, I found love and happiness and purpose. But I did it by leaving, not by forgiving. I did it by choosing myself over family dysfunction. I did it by refusing to believe that suffering was holy or that abuse was love misdirected. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere, a child is being told to forgive someone who hurts them. Somewhere, a grandmother is choosing silence over action. Somewhere, a father is raising his hand in anger, convinced he has the right. But somewhere else, a child is planning escape. Somewhere else, a teacher is asking the right questions. Somewhere else, someone is choosing protection over reputation, safety over silence, truth over comfortable lies. For them, I share this story. For them, I speak these truths. And for that girl I was, who jumped into darkness and found light, who ran from home and found herself, who refused to forgive and finally healed. She deserved better. They all deserve better. And maybe, if we tell enough true stories, if we refuse to be silent, if we stop making excuses for abusers and start protecting children, maybe someday better is what they'll get. That's my prayer. Not for forgiveness, but for change. Not for reconciliation, but for safety. Not for family loyalty, but for children who grow up unafraid in their own homes. Is that too much to ask? I don't think so. Not anymore.